welcome members, witnesses and those joining us online to the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee. This is our 16th meeting of 2020 session, and this is the 4th meeting that the committee has conducted remotely. And I'd particularly like to thank the broadcasting team on behalf of the committee for making this meeting possible. So, our main item of business this morning is taking evidence on our inquiry on COVID-19 and its impact on Scotland's businesses, workers and the economy. I'm very pleased this morning to welcome our first panel of witnesses. We have Benny Higgins and Jane Julia Unwin, who are both members of the Scottish Government's Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, and Charlie Smith, who is the Managing Director of SDI Scottish Enterprise. So can I start, please, by inviting Benny Higgins to make a short opening statement. Benny.
Thank you. We have been asked to make recommendations on economic recovery in Scotland. Perhaps in normal times one would talk about things being short-term, medium-term, long-term. I think that these unimaginable circumstances have rendered some of these kind of definitions more ambiguous. So it's probably easier to say what we're not being asked to look at, which is the immediate emergency actions required to keep the economy on a sort of life support system. So it is beyond that. To extend the analogy, it's looking at the rehabilitation and recovery of the economy. We are going about it with the following framework. We have a small inner circle advisory group of 8 people, including myself and Dame Julia. We, however, have had a very dynamic engagement framework where we have been engaging with as many parts of the Scottish economy as possible and continue to do so. Our deadline is to produce context and recommendations by the end of June. I hope we might even be able to do it a little bit better than that, but we're working very hard, flat out at the moment. We're right in the midst of a wall of consultation coming back to us from a variety of parties. The framework that we've adopted in terms of the structure of the report will be based in part on 4 pillars of capital. Of course, the barometer of success remains the National Performance Framework, but the 4 pillars of capital are the most conventional one of all, which is financial and physical capital, and the other 3 are natural capital, human capital and social capital. And our objective is to bring forward recommendations that can give Scotland a future which is robust, resilient and focuses on well-being.
Thank you very much, Benny. I think that sets the scene for the questions we're going to ask. So I'm going to move to questions from members. I'll invite each member to ask their question, and then I'll invite the witnesses. It would help if the members particularly want the question to be directed at one witness, if they could indicate at the beginning of their question who they would like it to go to. And then I will allow other witnesses to respond if they wish to. I will then go back to the member for a follow-up question, and once the member has completed, I'll move on to the next member. As I said earlier in the briefing, if you could keep your questions and answers succinct, that will actually help us to get through all the questions that we want to ask this morning. And don't forget to give broadcasting a few seconds just to get your mic on before you start speaking. So I'm going to go first of all to Alison Harris to ask the first question. Alison.
Good morning. If I could address my question to Benny Higgins, please. Will the advisory group produce a recovery plan with specific policies and actions, including clear plans for rollout, administration and budget implications?
Benny Higgins.
I think we have to be realistic about what's possible in a matter of weeks. What we will certainly be doing is setting a sense of direction of travel as part of our recommendations. I do aim that the group will put forward very clear recommendations about what interventions, whether it be structural, policy or institutional, should take place. I'm determined that we will be brave and, where possible, radical about making suggestions and recommendations. The full rollout plan would be inconceivable in the time frame that we have available. So I'm afraid there will have to be a great deal more work after this. I should also add that I don't expect many ideas to be brand new ideas, and the job of the advisory group is to curate ideas from around Scotland. I'm hoping that what we can do is shine a spotlight on ideas that have perhaps been buried for good or bad reasons in the past, or have not had sufficient oxygen. But we've realised in this crisis that if one puts one's mind to it, you can get a great deal done that maybe in the past couldn't be done in the sort of timeframes that we have been used to.
Thank you. For my follow-up question, I would just like to say, last week we heard from the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, the CBI Scotland and the FSB, and they were all pretty unanimous in their support for a unified four-nation approach to opening up the economy and beginning the recovery. So given that these organisations represent, so strongly the voice of business in Scotland, to what degree are you taking this recommendation on board in designing your recommendations for the Scottish Government in delivering the recovery here in Scotland?
I think that's again a distinction between the immediate requirements to lift lockdown and the longer term structural changes that are required. You can be sure that we're taking the opinions of business very seriously, as we are with other parts of society in Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Do any of the other witnesses wish to add to what has been said so far? No, everybody happy. In that case, can I move on to Willie Coffey, please? Willie.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to everybody. My question is really for anybody in the panel to answer if they wish. The advisory group, in its call for views, said it will consider the perspectives of those impacted by all the disruption caused by the health emergency, as well as those who will be critical in rebuilding Scotland's economy in a greener, fairer, more inclusive way, and so on. Firstly, how do you think you're going to achieve that in such a short timescale? And secondly, are you already seeing any new ways of working that might actually serve us all better as the economy starts to recover?
Well, maybe if I say a few words, and maybe Dame Julia could add a little to it. So first of all, absolutely, there's no denying that we are working to an incredibly short timescale, and that's why, in response to the previous question, I made the point that this is as much about curating ideas that need to be accelerated from past experience, rather than necessarily dreaming up entirely new interventions. But we do find ourselves in a very unique context, and as you have alluded to, there is, this crisis has been unequal in its impact on people, and that's something that's very close to our heart as we start to assess what needs to be done. But I'll hand over to Dame Julia.
Dame Julia.
That's really an important message, to recognise that nobody has been untouched by the crisis. So when we say we want to talk or listen to people who've been affected, that is the whole of Scotland, and that's clearly a tall order. But there are people who've been more affected or worse affected. I think we've listened to voices from civil society and the voluntary sector, to the trade unions, to business, to workforce issues. And I think we have to carry on doing so, because how we design the transition out of this crisis, and this is the task for Scottish Government, will determine where we end up next, will determine what the destination looks like. As Benny said, I think by looking at the capitals, we are able to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the social fabric of Scotland, the skills and training that's needed, as well as the business interests. And I hope we're going to hold all of those together.
Charlie Smith, do you want to add anything to that? Charlie?
No, I think we are to the point where are we seeing ways of working emerge that are somewhat more dynamic and integrated. I think the answer to that is yes, and I think we've seen some phenomenal work in the NHS Scotland supply chain, as well as public and private sectors come together to identify where there are perhaps gaps right now in funding that we would like to populate, but indeed, more importantly, I think, bring the business community together to curate opinion that will inform the advisory group's recommendations. I think that's the critical bit. I think this is about curating opinion from many from across every constituency to get their view on what we do next. So that's principally what we're here to do. But yes, there are several good examples that we've seen in the past 2 months, certainly.
Thank you. Willie, do you want to come back in?
Just very briefly, Convener, we're seeing lots of fabulous examples locally, particularly in the retail sector, with people using digital technology to alter the model of their business and so on. Does the panel see that that's going to stay with us and be part of the new model, the new way of working, or do you think we might go back to our normal ways of working after this emergency is over?
Who would like to respond to that? Benny and Julie. So I'll go with Benny first. Benny Higgins.
Thank you. No, I mean, hi. No, thank you. That's a very important question. You know, this has been, in some levels, the most unwanted but the most extraordinary social experiment of civilization. And you know, we have learned that actually in this time there are good things that have emerged. The spirit with which many people have adopted home working is clearly going to stay with us. But that's another area where, you know, the inequalities in our society have been laid bare. The top 50% of people in the UK by earnings largely can work from home, 90%, whereas in the bottom 50%, it's 10% can work from home. So I think we've learned a lot about things that we need to embrace going forward. So that is critical, and you know, we actually have a specific commission piece of work looking at the lessons learned during lockdown, which we hope we will be able to interpret and include within our recommendations. But I'll hand over to Dame Julia now.
Dame Julia?
I think I can only echo that. We have seen extraordinary ingenuity and enterprise, and that must stand us in good stead for the recovery. Some things will carry on into the future. I suspect we won't be using office space at the scale that we were before. I suspect conference centres will not be viable in the way they were before. But there is amazing imagination going on. I think we have to be very careful not to just fast forward from lessons learned in an emergency to say they will automatically apply in a more steady state. But certainly your retail example is a very good one. There has been extraordinary things shown at the small business level, which I think we should be hoping we can sustain into the long term.
Thank you. Are you happy, Willie?
Yes, thanks very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Right, can I move to Richard Lyle then, please? Richard.
Thank you, Convener. My question is to the group, but Benny Higgins first. The advisory group call for views states that the scope for new public spending will be constrained, and it welcomes thoughts on how existing resources and systems can be made more resilient. Are the group going to provide direction on whether existing strands of economic spending should be repurposed or even stopped altogether? And it's to Benny Higgins first.
Can we move to Benny Higgins?
Yeah, thank you. It's again a good question. We will be fiscally constrained. I don't think anybody should assume anything to the contrary. It would be unhelpful and unproductive. So with that background, what's absolutely essential is that we prioritise properly. We need to understand what are the most important things that we need to do to create a Scotland that is robust, that is resilient, that's ready for the next crisis, and that is focused on well-being. That will require that the prioritisation involved there will need us to look at things that need to be accelerated. But I'm afraid that the bedfellow of prioritising things is to deprioritise things. And we're in the midst of looking at the wall of suggestions coming to us from all sectors and all parts of Scotland. But I think that a test of good recommendations is that you make your choiceful about how you proceed in a constrained environment.
Thank you. Dame Julia, do you wish?
Yes, I would like to add to that. We're completely schooled on understanding the fiscal framework and the problems fiscal shortages that you will have and how difficult it will be for government to pay for things. We're also conscious there are other sources of funding within Scotland, and we're interested in how companies and investors can step up to help in this recovery, because there are other players who can contribute. So this is recommendations, of course, to Scottish Government, but it's calling on other parties to play their part. The recovery requires that breadth of input.
Thank you. Chris Smith, do you want to add anything? Sorry, Charlie Smith. Do you wish? No. Okay. Richard, back to you then.
Yeah, thank you, convener. Basically, Benny said hard choices. What are the hard choices? What would you suggest would be repurposed, or even what would you suggest would be stopped altogether? Because we could be then exercising a lot of pain if we stop things that people have taken years to build.
Yeah, I think it's a bit premature at the stage we're at in the group. It's over the next couple of weeks that we will be discussing the various proposals that are coming in and suggestions coming in from across Scotland. But just to take an example, it's not something we've agreed will be a recommendation, but Scotland has every reason to believe that it could be an absolute world leader in respect of natural capital. And if we're going to do that, we may have to look at, for example, is there a repurposing of some of the apparatus that lies in the North Sea around carbon sequestration? So that would be taking something that has been a historic strength, that some of which could be put to use in solving problems in the future, as well as being part of the past. But today's not really a day for me to start to say some of the things that are floating around which we haven't nailed down yet. So I think that if you don't mind, you'll have to wait a few weeks for that.
Thank you. I mean, clearly it's early days, and I think it's really what the committee want to have is an idea of the context in which you're receiving the thoughts that come in, and how you are going to be looking at those, the strategic direction of travel. Gordon MacDonald, please, next. Gordon.
Thank you, convener. Just to continue the discussion that Dick Lyle started regarding the fiscal framework. Given the size of the challenge faced by the Scottish Government in supporting the economy, is change required to the fiscal framework, in particular an increase in borrowing rules, and is that something the advisory group will be considering? I'm sorry, that's for Benny Higgins.
Okay, no worries, thank you. Yes, it is something we are considering. I think it's important, though, that we don't get caught up in. The fiscal framework is being revisited next year on schedule in any case, and it does need to be considered in this new context. I think everything that we do has to pivot to some degree on the new context in order to give ourselves the best chance to create the kind of nation that we all hope for. But I don't think that we should restrict the conversation to just simply being about the fiscal framework. It may well be that we need to look at ways in which we can advantage, for example, of the current low interest rates that would not necessarily just be liberated exclusively by the fiscal framework. There may be other arrangements. And so I don't want it to be, frank, be a political debate. I think it's got to be an economic debate.
Absolutely.
On the aspect of supporting businesses, the job retention scheme has stemmed job losses not just in Scotland but across the UK. Will you be looking at whether the job retention scheme should be retained beyond October, and whether companies should be contributing if they are able to? Bear in mind, many will have had no revenue for the last 3 months, and whether it should be phased out on a different timescale across different parts of the UK.
I think we need to consider it in the context of transition, because transition will have an impact on the ultimate consequences for the country, but not to the extent that it falls into the category of the immediate life support as I described it earlier. But one thing I can assure you is that when we look at the important themes that we face, unemployment is absolutely right up there with a number of others, but has as much importance as any. We have to get people back to work. We have to get people in a situation where their employment prospects are not devastated by this crisis. And in doing so, we have to also be careful to look specifically and make specific provision for the generation that actually could be really hurt by this and scarred in the long run, which I would suggest at least one group is the late teenagers into the kind of mid-20s who are coming out of either secondary or tertiary education into a very different world than they would have thought only a matter of months ago.
Thanks very much.
Yes, Dame Julia Unwin, you want to come in?
To underline that point, we know from all research over decades that if there is time lost from the labour market for that age group, the group that Benny's talked about, it's a scar across their working lives and their income until they retire. So one way or another, we need to find ways in which companies can step up and make a different sort of offer with support from government to make sure that the distance from the labour market is not too great for that group. Job retention has done that to a certain extent. It's not a long-term prospect, because actually being kept on 80% of wages at home doesn't keep you very close to the labour market. We need to get people back into work. And there are jobs in the recovery that we will need to make sure are targeted at that age group. Otherwise, Scotland will pay quite a high price, or a very high price, in 20, 30 years' time. That's really urgent.
Charlie Smith, what is Scottish Enterprise's view in terms of the job retention scheme? You must have been hearing from the people you support.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think for the purposes of this group, we are really here trying to make sure that we're curating the views of business and making sure the advisory group has those. I think clearly as the job retention scheme proceeds, there are concerns about the rise in unemployment. But I think, you know, what galvanises us as a collective is the need to create new jobs. You know, and I think to the point of prioritisation, make sure that we're bringing together the public ecosystem, the private sector, to focus on those industries where there are growth prospects, and in particular where I think in Scotland are, if you like, our advantage comparatively and competitively meets with opportunity. And I think to the point Benny made near the top of this session, you know, there are areas where we have extraordinary talent and capability, whether it be in natural capital, whether it be in emerging technology, whether it be in advanced manufacturing, and really being as forthright as optimistic we can be, and bringing the collective together to make sure that we're creating more employment in these areas and getting behind those who can really help us realise the opportunity that comes in the future, notwithstanding all the hardship that we know that many face right now.
Thank you. Quite key. Gordon MacDonald, did you want to say anything else?
No, it's
no. Thank you then. So I'll move on to Andy Whiteman, please. Andy.
Thanks very much, Convener, and welcome, panel. I want to explore a little bit more the challenges of tackling inequalities throughout all of this. The Institute of Public Policy Research produced an interesting report just a couple of weeks ago on rentier power and the contrast between the inequalities between the working poor who depend on incomes and the asset owning wealthy. And they're highlighting, of course, that the incomes of those who own assets or debts, banks and landlords, etc., have effectively been underwritten throughout this crisis. And that reflects a long-standing situation whereby wealth inequality has been far, far greater than income inequality. Now, given that's already been mentioned, the financial insecurity has disproportionately hit those on low incomes in precarious work, and particularly women. What work will you be doing to make sure that these very deep and long-standing problems can at least begin to be tackled?
Do you have someone you want to do?
I'm happy to go to Higgins and Dame Julia and Charlie Smith.
Right, okay, all of them. So Benny, then you.
Well, I'll open and then let Dame Julia talk to a subject which I know is close to her heart. First of all, the framework which we've adopted has two pillars of capital that I think are highly relevant here, which is human capital and social capital. So we are very concerned about Scotland being a successful well-being economy, and we will be looking at a number of factors that are relevant in terms of making sure that people can get back to work and that they are given a chance to sort of almost level up to a greater degree than has happened. When one thing we should acknowledge is that I sort of somewhat berated someone on a panel the other day when they were talking about bouncing back. I don't think we want to bounce back. It would understate, I think, some of the issues that we had coming into the crisis in Scotland, and therefore what we've got to do is treat this as an opportunity, a catalyst for doing things that perhaps we should have accelerated before, but we can accelerate now. Education is going to be crucial. Long life learning, skills development are all part of what we will be considering in terms of our recommendations. But I'll let Dame Julia pick up on this question too.
Thank you, Benny, and thank you. It's a very important question. This crisis has laid bare the really gross inequality, both in income and in wealth, in the way that you've just described. But it's also shone a very bright light on other sorts of inequality, the inequality of work status, how the jobs on which we have all entirely depended in the last 3 months are the least well regarded, the least well remunerated, and have the least progression. It's also shown us some of the really dark side of in-work poverty, because the people who are continuing to work, quite comical to see politicians talk about return to work when actually the front line, people the lowest paid, have all been working flat out during this crisis, are in the most insecure jobs with the least progression. So I welcome the IPPR report that you talked about, because I think it gives us a chance to say we need a reset. And Benny rightly says we won't be bouncing back. We need something that's a very different settlement. What that does to the owners of capital, I don't know, but I do know a very bright light has been shone on the behaviour of business leadership and business owners, and there is a very clear distinction in the public mind between those companies that have stepped up in this crisis, rewarded their staff, kept them close, made sure they were safe, and those that frankly didn't. And I think that's going to be a very big divide in public policy in the next couple of years. I think it's one that the advisory group can comment on. Certainly our priorities will be from people who have been locked out of the proceeds of growth when we had it. We can't afford for them to be locked out of the benefits of any sort of recovery over the next 2, 3, 4 years.
And Charlie, do you wish to add anything? Charlie Smith?
Well, what I would echo the fact it's an incredibly important question. And I think, as Benny has said, we've had an incredible amount of sort of dynamic engagement with business organisations, business leaders, and representations from companies across the breadth and depth of Scotland. And there is an emerging theme, and I think there's an emerging theme which is beyond the job creation and wealth creation and being part of an enterprise economy. I think business talks increasingly to the participation in the economy and its impact on society. And I think, judging by the volume of commentary that we've heard from certainly the business community on these subjects, I would imagine that'll be something very live that, I mean, Lord Smith is curating that business input, but I think you'll certainly hear in the representations we put forward to the advisory group a great deal about participation and ensuring that there is the right level of inclusion, that we understand businesses' contribution to society and indeed the mutuality that exists. So it's very current. It's a very, very strong theme through the conversations we're having, and therefore I would expect in the work that Lord Smith gives to the advisory group, it will be very much top of the agenda.
Thank you. Can I go back to Andy Whiteman? Andy, do you want to follow up on that?
Yes. Well, thanks very much, and it's not for me to tell the advisory group how to do its work, but I'm a little bit concerned about the remit where it says the group will advise on actions that will make a difference to businesses, and we hear a lot about businesses in the context of the economy. Businesses are part of the economy, but they're not the economy. The economy is about well-being, it's about resilience, it's about security, and all the rest of it. And we've seen that even with great businesses, they can be brought to their knees by a modest virus. I actually want to sort of conclude really with another question about, and it's maybe not your place to say, but I'd welcome any comments you have, because you've been asked to deliver some advice to a government about how we recover from a crisis. Now, we had a crisis 10 years ago, the banking crisis. And over the last 10 years, young people have seen their wages flatline. They have not seen the kind of opportunities that one might have anticipated should have been offered and built and constructed and expanded for younger people. It's simply not happened. Now, I don't want to get into debate about why that is, but I'm just a little bit sceptical about the ability and the political will that really exists to make sure that a group in society who suffered from the last crisis is not going to suffer from this crisis. I mean, what can you say to reassure me that we're going to do better than we did 10 years ago?
Benny Higgins, I know you wanted to come in.
Yeah.
Benny.
I'm not entirely sure what I can say to reassure you. What I can definitely tell you is that we will be doing our level best to make the right kinds of recommendations. You echo something I mentioned earlier, which is not to think that we came into the crisis in the best shape possible, and therefore it's not trying to get back to that. It's trying to find a brighter, more robust, resilient, fairer future. Another thing I would sort of say, the comment about the business sector. Just remember that 70% of Scots are employed by the private sector. It is important. It's not the only important thing, but that we do run a risk at times of, I'm afraid, relegating it too far in engagement. So it's very important that the business sector thrives to create jobs, to create growth for the economy. We want a well-being economy that is a growth well-being economy. The other point I would make is that something that underlies quite a lot of the conversation we've had in response to this question is a matter of trust. And, you know, since the financial crisis, there are many traditional institutions, and that includes the corporate sector, which had perhaps lost trust to some degree. As Julia said, this particular crisis has been an opportunity for companies to either, I'm afraid, emphasise why they should be trusted, and it's true for all organisations. I'm the chair of a wonderful charity called Systema Scotland, which, through the vehicle of music, supports children in some of the most deprived parts of Scotland. And in the last 8 weeks, that organisation has pivoted in a remarkable way to support the kids, using technology in a way that I think it would have taken us years had we not been forced to confront it. And the trust that the families and the communities have in that charity has been reinforced by the way it's responded. I think lots of people can learn from these lessons.
Thank you. Just as an addendum to that, I mean, obviously the issue of human and social capital and how we value that within our economy, within our business sector. Many years ago, when I was at university, we talked a lot about whether human and social capital should be a feature of accounting, whether actually there should be a value added to companies' balance sheets in terms of the human capital valued in terms of retention, training, these kind of things. Is that something that the committee will be looking at? And is it something that you as individuals think should be added to a company in terms of its value? Julia, Dame Julia, you're indicating you'd like to come in. Mm-hmm.
There's a very live debate across the world about how we account for these capitals. What's really clear in thinking about recovery is there will be no safe recovery unless we attend to social and human capital. The one thing that will undermine any recovery is a deeply divided society in which there is no trust and no certainty. As we know that we are headed for very precarious times in other ways, there may well be other pathogens, there will certainly be climate change shocks. I think we as a group have been very fixed on the notion that the capitals are equal and that how we treat people, human capital, their training, their employment, their progression, and how we treat society as social capital isn't an add-on, it's central to economic recovery, because economic recovery will be jeopardised if we don't get that right. And that's why I think it's been so important that we're taking a four capitals approach. Many, many businesses are beginning to report that way. Whether it should be a requirement or not is a different discussion, but many businesses are now interested in the capitals approach.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's been a shift over the years, maybe more visibly than in perhaps reality, in terms of the creation of mission statements and that sort of valuation of training. But it's never been put in accounting terms onto balance sheets to say, you know, this is part of the value of the company. And that debate's certainly been raging for the 35 years I've been involved with it. So I think that would be quite an interesting area. Rhoda Grant, you're next. Can I go to Rhoda Grant, please?
Thank you. Can I just press Dame Julia a little more? I mean, we've talked about the scarring of young people's careers. We've talked about women and lower skilled workers kind of bearing the brunt of the economic crisis that is due to follow. How do we stop that happening? And you've talked about a different offer. So what would that offer be, and how could we create more equality in the employment market?
So Dame Julia, I think that was to you.
It was, and I just wait. Can you hear me now? Forgive me, I was muted. Yeah. I think it's a huge question, and it's one that we've been wrestling with for some time. I think in the context of recovery, there are things you can do. There is, for example, in the Edinburgh Guarantee, which I know worked very effectively for a time when business took some responsibility for making sure young people furthest from the labour market had an opportunity. But I think it's deeper than that. I think it's to do with expectations. I think it's to do with how you procure. I think it's how the anchor institutions in every locality behave, what their employment practices are. Because we know employment practices go through supply chains. Deeply economic issue, therefore, how we address those deep-seated inequalities. I've always argued that if you are outsourcing your cleaning contract, you are hardwiring poverty into your local community. I think that's more true now than it ever was, and I think looking at how supply chains operate is going to be very important.
Does anybody else want to come in on that? No? Back to you then, Rhoda. Rhoda Grant.
So if we are looking at how we procure and the like, should we bring those kind of jobs in-house and value them? And I was listening to someone say quite recently that, you know, within the care sector, while a lot of that work was outsourced, and there were outcomes and training involved, that was very rarely happening, and that was having an impact not only on the workers but on the people that were being cared for. Is that the kind of thing you are talking about, or should we be looking at something more fundamental?
I think the care sector is the sector that has been exposed as so dysfunctional and has created so many the financing of the care sector and the way in which procurement is done has created so many of the crises that we're facing. I know there's a very live discussion in Scotland about how the care sector should be supported in the future, but this is absolutely vital to get that right. There's a very real risk that reverting to the existing part of the care sector will simply not be good enough for what we're trying to do at the moment. I do know that in Scotland and other places there's a lot of talk going on about that. But in the Economic Advisory Group, we're also conscious the provision of care is part of the economy. It's not something that happens separately. It's what enables people to go to work, but it's also employing a very large number of people. And we've learned, if we didn't know already, they've been employed in rather precarious and risky ways. So therefore it is a top priority, and it's certainly something we've discussed in the advisory group.
Does the gig economy play into that as well? Because we've seen a lot of young people in unstable zero-hour contracts. Should we be getting rid of that kind of employment practice?
I think there are big questions to ask about the regulation of employment. One of the things we've learned, certainly south of the border in England, is the scale of the gig economy meant that quite a lot of the furloughing schemes and so on just didn't touch the sides for many people, not just young people who were precariously employed. I know it's at a lower level in Scotland, but you have got the regulatory tools to intervene and to ensure that that doesn't create its own deep insecurity. I've always thought that casual work is suitable for some people at some stages of their lives, and it's an absolute catastrophe if it becomes part of a working life, so it goes on beyond 6 months after somebody leaves school. I think it's really troubling what we've created in that.
Does anyone else?
Does anyone else wish to come in on those questions? No. Okay, Rhoda, have you anything else to ask?
Yes, could I ask Charlie Smith about the role of enterprise and skills agencies and local authorities? All of those agencies have had pretty severe budget cuts in the past, and I wonder what capacity they have to support the economy through the COVID-19 challenges and coming out of this situation. Do they have any capacity at all, and what do we need to do to build that capacity?
So can we go to Charlie Smith, please? Thank you. Charlie.
Thank you, Rhoda. I don't think any of the enterprise and skills agencies are like any other institution, public or private. I think we have all had to prioritise and pivot resource to where we think certainly the greatest need is now, as we have been responding and I think in attempting to reset. I think the balance with is how we deal with the here and now and the urgency of now as a community, and how we wrap around those that need our help, while making sure that we have an eye on the restart and recover phase. And I think critically as part of this work, I think hopefully that there'll be a set of recommendations which help start to put some shape around what the future looks like, and the government will take those and will bring them to our attention as they deem appropriate. But I think I have seen personally on a daily basis a significant amount of movement and prioritisation that I say mirrors what we'd be doing everywhere else. Clearly, there's simply not enough help that you can give. I mean, this virus has made an acute and an unparalleled impact on the community. So there is no end to the amount of help. But what I have certainly seen is a very dynamic pivoting of our collective resources, and that's not, and critically here, not as independent agencies. I think the partnership, not just across Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands in the south, but in addition with Visit Scotland, Creative Scotland, Scotland's Futures Trust, SAT, many others coming together to think about how we solve some of these problems collectively. And that's about prioritising within our own organisations, but across the enterprise and skills system. So it's a very difficult question to answer. There's no amount of help, but what I'm saying is I think that we are pivoting and prioritising very dynamically as we work our way through this crisis.
And just very, very briefly, I mean, given we're looking at revisions that look like budget cuts, certainly to Highlands and Islands Enterprise, I mean, how are they going to be able, in a place, to react to some of those challenges?
Well, I'm not really in a position to answer that specifically, the Highlands and Islands, and I know the Cabinet Secretary will be before the committee on Tuesday, as many of the other enterprise agencies will in time. I think it comes down to the prioritisation question again. We are all across public, private sector. Everyone's going to be working within fiscal constraints, and that means the method and the speed at which we prioritise becomes critical.
Thank you. Benny Higgins wants to come in on that. Benny.
Yeah, just very briefly, but just to give you a reassurance that when I said we've been seeking to be in dialogue, not just with different institutions, different sectors, but also different regions of Scotland. I've had 2 conversations with members of the board, the full board in one instance, and some of the board, including the chairman of Highlands and Islands Enterprise in the last few weeks, and they are very clear that I'm expecting them to bring forward what they think are the matters that should be accelerated and sort of, if you like, re-energised. And they seem very enthusiastic about the opportunity, so I'm looking forward to hearing from them.
Thank you. Okay, Rhoda?
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to move on now to Dean Lockhart, please. Dean.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to our panel. The last time Mr Higgins gave evidence to the committee was in relation to the Scottish National Investment Bank And my first question is, to what extent has the COVID crisis impacted the implementation timeline for the bank to be established and to be up and running? And what role will the bank have in dealing with the economic recovery? And a wider question to the panel members. The bank was set up to provide more long-term patient capital to the economy, but given the immediate needs of many companies for capital, what's the balance in the tension of allocating resource for long-term patient capital and allocating resource for the immediate needs of the economy?
So who are we going to go to? Benny, I think it's you again.
Probably, yeah. For those members of the committee who don't know, I have been and remain a strategic advisor to the First Minister on the creation of the Scottish National Investment Bank, so it's not unreasonable I attempt to answer this question. To be honest, it's not so much the COVID crisis that will have an impact on the timeline. It's probably more likely to be other matters that were already around prior to this crisis, such as getting through state aid approval. It was always the plan to launch the bank, open the doors, sometime between July and the end of the year. My best guess is that with a fair wind, it will remain in that window, but probably towards the end of autumn. So that's the answer to the first question. That's my best guess. But there are some unknowns, particularly state aid, which isn't entirely within the hands of the project team or the newly appointed chair, Willie Watt, or the chief executive. So that's one thing. The second thing is, the bank was always being created not as a silver bullet solution to economic problems. It was filling a particular gap, and the gap had two aspects to it. One was the patient capital that you've referred to, investing in Scotland in ways that prepared it for the mid-21st century around the green agenda, the climate emergency, the demographic challenges, and the transition through the fourth industrial revolution. As those of us of a certain age in Scotland know, transitions can be very problematic, and it's really important, and it's even more important in the wake of the COVID crisis, that Scotland is prepared to invest patient capital in the long term. But the bank also was looking at supporting businesses to scale up to achieve their ambition. There's a slightly awkward size of companies, and it's not exclusive to Scotland, when scaling up becomes quite problematic. They're sort of too small for some of the bigger investors, and they're too big for others. It tends to be those looking for single figure millions of either equity or debt raising. That's another area the bank was to be focused on. That remains absolutely true. Will the bank be affected, and will it have to pivot to some degree due to COVID? Of course, nobody's exempt from having to respond to this particular crisis. But it's just as important to remember that the bank must work hand in glove with other parts of the apparatus in Scotland, the enterprise agencies and other aspects, which, to be honest, in my original implementation plan, which is now more than 2 years old, I did say that we had to seek to unclutter the landscape so that companies did find it easier to get support. At the moment, some people are very pleased with the support they get, others find it quite a baffling array of choices and end up getting insufficient support. So, the bank, if we didn't have a national investment bank about to open, this crisis, I think, would have triggered a desire to look at it. Its importance is as great as it ever could have been, but let's just remember what it is there to do, and there's going to have to be resources to support businesses and other aspects of our society through other means.
Thank you. Dean.
Thanks very much for that answer. I guess I would like to ask the same question of Charlie Smith in terms of the balancing the enterprise development model of Scottish Enterprise in terms of supporting companies looking to expand versus giving capital and supporting existing businesses that have established themselves and making sure those businesses see their way through the crisis.
Thank you, Dean. It is a challenge that's very alive with us right now, as you can imagine. We have companies across Scotland of all shapes and sizes who obviously have very difficult challenges that they are facing that they have not in many cases faced before, and a lot of those challenges go to, in the short term, how they manage cash in their own working capital. And I think the challenge has been in the here and now, saying, well, there is a suite of UK interventions. What do those UK interventions address? And that's not just furlough, but that's CBILS bounce back, and then more recently their announcement on the Future Fund, which addresses early stage finance. So to what extent do they address the needs of the community in Scotland? I think we are working to say in the here and now, well, where do we think the gaps exist, and what is available to us in the here and now to make sure that the right sums of money get to the places that are not served by those interventions. The task is, of course, moving at pace, having sufficient diligence and analysis that makes sure that that money is going to stick and is getting to those businesses that can see through an incredibly difficult period and endure. And that's the method by which we're analysing the here and now. As we look forward, clearly, we know that there is opportunity, and I think I mentioned before, there is a huge amount of work that we've been doing, looking at where our advantage meets opportunity going forward. And certainly as we galvanise around key major economic opportunities, whether it be indeed low carbon or advanced manufacturing or indeed emerging technology, where business needs help to realise their potential. And I think as we pivot, not only human resource, the conversation with the government, indeed the cabinet, who will debate these matters, is how we get that balance right. So we're right in the midst of it right now, Dean. What I would say to you is we're working very actively to make sure that we are retaining the balance as best as we can within the resource envelope that we have.
Dean, you want to come back?
Yeah, thanks both for those answers. Just to follow a question on the capital required in the economy, because there's a huge amount of recapitalisation in the form of debt and equity required. The UK Treasury has announced Project Birch, which is a kind of forward-looking policy measure to rescue companies that are otherwise viable businesses, but for the crisis. Would like to clarify, what role will the advisory group have in this recapitalisation exercise? And whatever policy measures are introduced, in my mind, at the end of the day, the single most important issue here is, frankly, the size of the UK Treasury's balance sheet and how much money is available for recapitalisation in the economy. So I'd like to get the views of Benny Higgins and Charlie in how Scottish companies can benefit from this recapitalisation programme.
Benny, do you want to go first? Benny Higgins?
Yes, I shall. Thank you. No, an extremely pointed and good question. There will need to be recapitalisation taking place. The estimate I've heard for the whole of the UK could be as much as over £100 billion, and one would anticipate Scotland would be, I don't know, say a tenth of that. We will make recommendations around recapitalisation, and it is an area where we will, although our recommendations for the most part may be aimed at Scottish Government, we will have to recognise that in some areas such as this, there will be a need to embrace the Westminster position and make it clear what we think would be helpful. I think the other thing to say on recapitalisation is we will have to look at how the private sector can step forward. The banks and private equity firms and so on. I think the banks will have to pivot themselves in relation to forbearance, but these are all matters that we are in the middle of discussing with different parties to come up with what we think is a sensible recommendation.
And Charlie Smith, you want to come back on that one?
Yeah, very briefly. I think the only thing I would add is to say, one of the things that we are actively doing now is making sure that we're putting ourselves in a position where the recapitalisation that's taking place, we really understand the landscape in as forensic detail we can across Scotland at regional, national, regional, local level, and the companies that exist therein. So who could and should benefit from that? And indeed, to Benny's point, how do we make sure that we work with the private sector, the shareholder community, the banking community, to make sure that those that can step in and participate and help at this time do. But we are, with and in partnership with government and other enterprise agencies, we're looking at strategic, critical, national, regional, local companies at a very forensic level and having those discussions very actively and proactively right now.
Dean, are you wanting to come back? Oh, Benny wants to
come back. I think Benny had some follow-up.
Yeah. Benny?
Yes, sorry, one point I wanted to make that I didn't make. One of the concerns I have is that, the banking sector, for example, has numerous classifications for what an SME is by size. And I think that some of the programmes around recapitalisation will be, are likely to be taken up by kind of mid-sized companies, which are very important, and we need to look after that part of the economy. But I do fear for a lot of the very small businesses, are typically sole proprietor businesses, of which there are so many, facing, frankly, issues that they haven't had to face before and wouldn't readily or naturally understand even some of the language that might be used. And therefore, I think we really need to take very special care over that segment of very small businesses who will be facing, this crisis, and are in the teeth of it as much as anyone.
I think that is actually very, very true. Charlie Smith, you're nodding. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I was merely acknowledging Benny's point about the small business community.
Can I ask, in terms of the enterprise company, Scottish Enterprise particularly, there's always been quite a focus on startups, getting those numbers up in terms of startups, and those high growth businesses, which are deemed to be, quick wins in terms of increasing employment, etc. But there's always been a slight gap in terms of those very solid, long-term, not very exciting maybe, but certainly good providers in terms of income. Do you think this Scottish Enterprise will be pivoting more around looking at people who they think might have a more solid long-term future than some of the ones that we've seen big investment go into? I know in my own local area, in companies that have had big investment, big interest by Scottish Government, by yourselves, and then 2 years later, 3 years later, 5 years later, they're away. They've had all the grants, they've had all the investment, and then they're gone, and we see hundreds of jobs lost at the same time. So, is this crisis changing some of that attitude and approach?
Well, I don't think it's, I can only speak for us. I think we published a strategic framework at Scottish Enterprise, I think it was just over a year ago now, called Building Scotland's Futures Today, and I think we very clearly stated our intent in there, which was we want to help the fuel gap business across the nation. We're not there to self-segment. And that actually, when we are looking at support, it's critical that it is not a one-off, it's not a payment, it's not a particular bit of advice. Indeed, I think many of the companies that you will find we have either invested in through the Scottish Investment Bank, or we have provided support to through our grant infrastructures, are companies that we've worked with for some considerable time. And in fact, this week actually, Ernst & Young published their annual FDI report, and I think what was really encouraging in that from our point of view is, yes, not only have we maintained our performance and attracted new projects and actually outpaced the UK in terms of number of new projects that we're bringing to the country and the jobs that go with it, but really critically, I think what we're seeing is a lot of growth organically with the companies that are already in Scotland that we continue to have ongoing relationships with. And I think that's really where we hit the sweet spot. I think when we see those inward investors come work with Indigenous companies and the talent and the skills and the swap and the sharing of the talent, we have to be there to curate that and facilitate that and make sure that we see it through. So the crisis definitely means that we, along with many other public institutions in the government, are going to take a more substantive role right now and a degree in the future, and making sure that we're creating the right environment for business to to sustain and grow. But that's not something that we've thought about as a result of the crisis. Indeed, I think it was something that we talked quite a great deal about in our framework that we published a year ago.
Thank you. Can I move to Colin Beattie then, please? Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Much of Scotland's economic growth ambitions were centred around internationalisation. Two questions from that. Is it still realistic to believe that's going to happen in a COVID-19 world or post-COVID-19 world? And secondly, are we going to need to revisit the various Scottish Government strategies around trade and the 4 I's? And I'd be happy if any of the panel respond.
Okay, so who would like to come in first on that? Just give me a wave. Don't all jump at once. Okay, Benny Higgins, off you go. Benny.
Okay. Well, I'll say a few words. I think Charlie should respond to this too. First of all, it's not so much is it still realistic. I think it's essential. Brand Scott, we've got an opportunity to use these events as a catalyst to reinforce what Scotland stands for. Our tourism and hospitality sector has taken an incredible blow through this crisis. But it's a very important, as a single aspect, it's an important part of what Scotland needs to be to show the rest of the world. But we need to react to the changing times. So, for example, there is a school of thought that tourism may become a more premium activity for some time to come. The question is, how do we ensure that the tourism and hospitality sector in Scotland is fit for that purpose? The importance of inward investment, and we've talked through this conversation about the inevitability of fiscal constraints, and one response has to be to up our game in terms of inward investment. So I think that agenda has to be, alongside many of the other things we've touched on today, has been very much at the heart of what Scotland needs to do in the recovery mode. But Charlie, you've been doing some work on this.
Yeah, thanks, Benny. It's certainly been a very live conversation, and indeed I've been with government colleagues and in fact with many of the different constituencies that we have been consulting with in the past few weeks and continue to. We have already had several meetings. In fact, I think probably the advisory groups had 2 meetings on this specifically. I think you're right to say that clearly the dynamics have somewhat changed, and there is increased uncertainty. Now, there was Brexit, and there is Brexit, and Brexit now is still very much there. And clearly, when it comes to trade, we need to see what passes. But we're also in a position where COVID has made many markets and countries think about things from a policy point of view in terms of the way that they will choose to trade and the basis on which they're happy to trade with it. And then we've got an oil price, and all those things come together to make it an incredibly challenging situation. But what we have got 2 things at the moment, I think, in inward investment and trade. We have worked with the government very hard to look at the current position. We published, I think just over a year ago now, a Trading Nation, which was, if you like, a strategy and a plan to look at export markets and how we create growth therein. But in addition, we've been looking at inward investment, and I think, as you can imagine right now, it's something we need to say there's going to be an impact, there's going to be huge challenges, but to Benny's point, with all the issues that come before us, inward investment and trade remain 2 critical levers. And I think, lest we forget, we have an extraordinary product to sell, and Benny alluded to tourism being one area which has been hit incredibly hard, and we've got to work as hard as we can to get that industry back, not just because it's incredibly important to jobs in this country, but because of the contribution it makes to the wider economy, and not just economically but fiscally too. But as you can imagine, we have many companies here now that have product that we believe many markets do and will continue to want to buy from us. And I think it's really, really important that we face right into the challenges, but we don't lose sight of the importance of inward investment and trade, and that we do all that we can to focus on the markets and the product sets and the areas that we have advantage to realise that opportunity. So I think we're probably looking at something where I think we've spread ourselves quite far and wide, and perhaps we're somewhat more forensic and do a bit more fly fishing into the markets where we believe the very real opportunity exists.
Colin, do you want to come back in?
Yes, please. Obviously, I'm quite interested in the comments also on Brexit, and I assume that Brexit is being factored into the recovery recommendations when they come out. And it does take two to tango with internationalisation, because obviously we have, on the one hand, the enormous issue of our relationship with the EU and all the uncertainties as to how trade is going to develop, not just as a result of that, but as a result of COVID-19 with countries overseas. And at this moment, it seems we're really in a bit of limbo on this. Would that be correct at this point?
Charlie, do you want to come back initially?
Well, there is a huge amount of uncertainty. I mean, coronavirus alone is people are making judgments, and governments, companies, institutions across the world are having to work very dynamically to look at the position there is. Would I characterise as limbo? I think we feel quite personally, and I think the representations that we have, along with others in the business community, made to the advisory group, is that inward investment in trade remains an incredibly important part of our economy, and we have to continue to pursue these jobs, this IP, those innovations, those R&Ds, and bring them to our country, work with indigenous organisations, and help our huge exporters who in turn have significant create jobs and create wealth in the country, and help them do what they can. So I would describe it as limbo. I would just describe it as we have a stacked set of challenges, but we have to continue to work very, very hard and very forensically to see our way through them.
Thank you. Benny's indicating he'd like to come in as well. Benny Higgins.
Yes, I think we must avoid limbo. We must avoid limbo at all costs. That will not get us anywhere. We must confront the challenges. They ain't going away. Brexit's not going away. There's a much higher risk of a kind of effectively WTO exit in January. That will present its own difficulties. But let's not forget the most important thing, whether it be within the country or as we face out into the international kind of domain, that Scotland has to make sure that it plays to its strengths. Any strategy I've ever seen in the business world where I have spent my career that is effective is based on your strengths. It's not about trying to make up a strength that you don't have. And we have got incredible strengths. You know, we talked about tourism, hospitality. It's not that it can't be better, but there are grounds to believe that we can make it truly world class. Our university sector is the envy of the world in some cases, but yet we could get more from it in terms of its ability to develop and commercialise. So I think one of the things we need to be better at coming out of this crisis is not just chasing down every opportunity, but being more focused and choiceful, and make sure that we present a prospectus for Scotland that is as good as it can be, and I think it can truly be very exceptional.
Colin, have you finished?
Yes, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to ask one quick question. Tourism has been mentioned a lot in terms of one of our major areas that we could revive. You talked about the fact that premium tourism is likely to be a focus going forward. But one of my concerns has been that the coach companies in which Scottish tourism is really quite dependent due to the nature of our rurality and ease of getting around to visit many of the features that particularly premium visitors are likely to want to go and see. And yet the coach companies have not had much support during this crisis, and we've seen shearings disappear, certainly one that is big around where I live. And I just wondered whether, when you're looking at all this, whether the access to our tourist opportunities is in your sights, and whether you've had any views or thoughts around the lack of support that's been there that might impact on our recovery going forward. I've lost everybody's pictures, that's better. Does anyone have any thoughts or comment that they can make around that? Deathly silent. All right, Benny, you're a good volunteer, Benny.
Yeah.
Off you go.
And I need to be. No, you make an extremely good point. I've got a very close personal friend that runs a tourist bus company in Edinburgh, and you know the prospects are very, very daunting. And of course, you know, whatever the development of the kind of social distancing rules will have a very big impact on them, as it will in most parts of hospitality. And I make no comment on a subject I'm not equipped to speak on, but the facts are the consequences are quite significant. I'm afraid I have to stick with the point I made earlier, is that we've not paid any attention to the, if you like, the life support aspects of this. But we are very focused on the tourism sector as one of the key sectors. I have had conversations with the Tourist Board in Scotland, and they are very clear about the opportunity to bring forward what they think needs done to be considered and curated by the advisory group. So the point you're making will be addressed. Whether there is a really good answer to that very difficult question remains to be seen. I mean, I'm taking the view, and it's why we've used the dynamic engagement framework the way we have, that the people who understand that sector best are those who participate in it. And it's the players in the sector that I want to lean on for their expertise. So I've stressed to everybody we speak to, you know, it's okay giving us context and describing the problem, but this is an opportunity to put into the spotlight interventions that can make a difference. It's hard to do it, but it's worth doing it.
Well, I totally recognise and accept the committee's remit in terms of looking at the future. I think there is, without doubt, a link between your recommendations that you're going to come to around how the future might look and how our economy can recover, and that probably should be informing the actions we need to take during this crisis to make sure the building blocks are there. Because if you make a recommendation, meanwhile, all the building blocks are being undermined and disappearing, it all becomes pretty irrelevant, doesn't it? So,
I think I said earlier in this conversation that, you know, the nature of the transition from crisis, emergency action, sort of restart, does have a clear and unequivocal impact on the longer term development and recovery and rehabilitation in the economy. So I take your point. Absolutely, but in the time we've got available, we've just got to try and find our way through this as best we can.
Fine, thank you. I've got a final question from Dean Lockhart, so we'll go back to Dean. Dean. I think he's still muted.
Yeah, I'm on now. Thank you, convener. A question for Charlie Smith. Just a brief follow-up on Colin Beattie's discussion about increasing Scotland's international trade. What steps are being taken to help Scottish business increase their online trade and e-commerce activities? And a very brief follow-up for Benny Higgins. Once the recommendations of the advisory group have been presented to the government at the end of June, in what capacity does the group sit after this period? And are there any plans to have a formal parliamentary scrutiny of the advisory group?
So if we go to Charlie Smith first, and then Benny Higgins afterwards. Charlie.
Hi, yes. So I clearly all that goes with our digital capability and the skills that are with it have been a very live issue for many years now. In a previous career, you know, I think 15 years ago we were looking at e-commerce and what we were selling online, and I think it's been a continual investment from across government and the enterprise community. I think there's been any number of programmes across sectors and subsectors to look to induce and help people acquire skills and indeed the ability to deploy platforms and capability that allow them to trade online. But I think your question is particularly pertinent at the minute because I think e-commerce has in some cases, well, and probably most cases right now, is the predominant channel through which companies are currently doing business, and I think as a channel will gain more prominence over time. So one of the things we are actively talking with the government right now is how we are not only maintaining some of the current efforts, but how do we help those companies seek to trade, not just deploy the technology that gives them the right, but enables them to understand what's required in the markets where they believe there is an opportunity. I think the capability is one thing, but then being able to use the capability efficiently well is another. And to do that, you've got to understand the dynamics acutely within the market and how you can not just deploy that activity to generate income and sales, but use it safely and securely. So there has been a lot of work going on across agencies in government, but yes, I think they need to step up those activities given the exponential growth in the channel that is e-commerce, and what is likely to sustain it certainly means that we're very actively looking now at what programs we can bring in addition to those that we've already had to support all the sectors and subsectors who could benefit from increased e-commerce trade from Scotland.
Thank you. Benny, you want to answer the other question?
Yes. Well, one of the oldest cliches is that when you've got a complex problem to solve, you have to get a busy person to help you. This is a very, very complex problem, and I've asked some of the busiest people that I could find to help, but they are incredibly able, including Dame Julia, who's here with us today. I did so on the basis that this was a piece of work that would last until the end of June. Once we've made the recommendations, it will be up to Scottish Government to decide which recommendations to proceed with and to decide how they do so. That will be beyond the group that's been set up. That's not to say there might not be a role for some of the group or whatever, but that's beyond the scope of what we are doing now. On the second point of parliamentary scrutiny, I'm not sure whether Dean means scrutiny of the process. Was that what you meant, Dean?
It was scrutiny, I guess, of the recommendations, and if the advisory group is going to exist beyond June, possibly further committee scrutiny of the work of the group.
Yeah, well, obviously I've answered the first part of the question about where we stand in relation to the group, and when the group's work is done when we get to the end of June, so we'd need to restart in some other shape or form. As far as the scrutiny goes, I mean, I'm unaware of how we will proceed in terms of scrutiny. I think parliamentary scrutiny of the work of the group in terms of its recommendations would be a lot more productive than scrutiny of how we've gone about it, to be honest. Yeah, that's not for me to decide. So as far as I'm concerned, I need to get, with the support of the group, the recommendations out by the end of June. I hope they are recommendations that can make a difference.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask, Benny, I mean, that report obviously is to government. Will it be made available for the Economy Committee to have a look at, do you think?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I do know that it's been commissioned by Fiona Hislop, but I'm sure others will be able to give you a better answer than I can.
Okay, well, I'm sure we can pose that to the Cabinet Secretary when she comes to see us next week. Okay, that completes our questions. I don't have any other bids from members to ask any further questions. So can I just take this opportunity to thank Benny Higgins, Dame Julia Unwin and Charlie Smith for their time. I think that's been helpful, and no doubt we'll probably see you all again. I'm actually going to suspend the meeting very briefly now just to give members a chance for a comfort break if they wish it, but we'll resume in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, thank you, and welcome back to the second half of our committee. And I'm very pleased to welcome James Smith, who's the Research Director at the Resolution Foundation, who's joined us today as the only member of the second panel. So, James, obviously all questions are to you. We'll do as before. I'll move to questions from members, and I would ask that you keep your questions and your answers succinct, and just make sure that you give it a couple of minutes for your microphones to go on before you start speaking. So I'm going to begin with the first question from Alison Harris, please. Alison.
Thank you, Convener. Publications by the RF suggest that households and businesses are facing the largest economic downturn in living memory, with even benign forecasts suggesting that we will have the highest unemployment rate in more than 25 years. What scale of downturn are we likely to see in Scotland over the next 2 to 3 years? Have you any further thoughts on that, please?
Yes, of course, and thank you for having me this morning. I guess you're referring to particularly work that we've seen from the Office for Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England, both of which have produced scenarios for the impact of coronavirus on the UK economy as a whole. So those impacts very large in both cases. So the Office for Budget Responsibility see a fall of 35% in GDP in the second quarter of this year. That would be completely unprecedented, let alone living memory. And for the year as a whole, both the bank, the OBR, and the work that the Resolution Foundation has done as well point to falls in GDP of around 15% for the year as a whole. And if we saw that, that would be the deepest recession for 300 years for the UK as a whole, based on long-term data the Bank of England published. So, I mean, at the risk of pointing out something pretty obvious here, we are facing an incredibly large hit to the economy. Just to put that in context, every year the Bank of England do a set of stress tests that try and test the resilience of the banking sector. They put together a scenario for that in terms of the impact on the economy, and those scenarios were actually more optimistic than what we're seeing in the work that the OBR and the bank have put out now. So it's a huge hit to the economy. It's a huge hit to the economy as a whole. What makes it incredibly difficult in terms of policy and planning is that so much of it is dependent on the very uncertain progress of the virus. So that's the kind of big thing in the interaction of policy and the impact of the virus, and perhaps we can come on and talk a bit more about that. But just to your question about what that means, so in the OBR and Bank of England scenarios, you basically have the lockdown being unwound from June, which we're seeing some tentative steps in that direction in differential ways across the countries of the UK, and we're in some ways we're on track for that. But then in the second half of the year, you see a relatively rapid recovery in those scenarios. Now, the big question is whether we see those. So that's the big uncertainty, and a lot will be obviously determined by the impact of the virus as a whole, how that unfolds, and what policy does in terms of the response to that. So that's the UK situation, huge unprecedented hit to the economy. In terms of the impact in Scotland itself, it's a lot of what I've said about the UK will apply very much to Scotland as well. I don't have Scotland specific numbers to talk to you about, but I guess there are a number of reasons to think that the impact in Scotland could be a little larger, particularly in some respects. So, for example, the sort of sectoral composition of the Scottish economy, where particularly oil production is something that is a feature of the Scottish economy, not to the same degree or anything like that in the rest of the UK. And we've seen at least halving of oil prices, the IEA talking about the largest fall in oil investment ever recorded. So, that sector's particularly hard hit. And then I guess I would highlight, some of the important sectors for Scotland. So around 13% of the economy, around 90% of the employment is a combination of distribution, hotels, restaurants. So, you know, that's a little larger than elsewhere, and sort of looking at the impact on the labour market itself. So the Resolution Foundation have just been publishing details of a survey that we've been running into the impact, particularly in the labour market, of what's going on at the moment. So we commissioned YouGov to go out and survey over 6,000 people throughout the UK, and basically that research shows that Scotland has the largest proportion of people who have outright lost their jobs already. That's about 6%. In our survey work, but there's around a third of people who have seen some major change to their job. Either they're on shorter hours, or they've gone onto the furlough scheme, or they've lost their job outright. So there's a big hit to the labour market. You know, it's not completely outsized in Scotland relative to elsewhere, but it's certainly a big effect there. I guess the other thing to mention briefly about the Scottish economy is has a slightly higher proportion of people working in the public sector. So there's some good news there to the degree that means that those jobs will be safer and people will be a little bit protected. So huge hit to the overall UK economy. Definitely reasons to be concerned about what's happening in Scotland particularly.
Thank you very much for that very full answer. Thank you, convener.
In that case, can I move to my deputy convener, please, Willie Coffey?
Thanks very much, convener. Good morning, James. I wonder if you were listening into the previous discussion we had with the other panel. One of the comments, quite worrying, I think, made by Julia Unman was really about the impact on our young people and the worrying prospects for young people coming out of school into the world of work or university, into a very different economy now. Is your organisation cited in that issue at all, and could you offer us a view on what that might look like? And also, are you able to look at any other international experiences of the crisis to offer us a wee glimpse of what might be working elsewhere? Because we know we're maybe a few weeks or months behind other economies in their journey back. So are you able to offer us any kind of perspective on what's happening elsewhere, and particularly for young people coming into the economy as it stands now?
Okay, I'll take the first of those first, and then come on to the international picture in a second. So we have been doing work on the impact, particularly on young people. So you're absolutely right to highlight that issue. So a big thing that we've seen in past recessions is that if you leave school or you leave higher education during an extremely sharp recession, then that doesn't just have an effect on your immediate job prospects. It affects this key development stage of your career. So there's a bit more of a lasting effect, particularly for that group. So that's something that could is a particularly live policy issue. I think it's something that policymakers should definitely be thinking really hard about. And just to put that in perspective, if you take the OBR numbers at face value, you could be looking by our calculations at something like 600,000 increase in unemployment of people between 18 and 24. So the really big increase in unemployment for that group. If I may, I'll just say a little bit about a potential policy for that group. So I think it falls basically into two categories. So one is putting in place measures to keep people in education for longer. So providing maintenance payments, active career planning advice to people in schools. So definitely operating to help people who want to take a very formal academic route, but that won't be for everyone. And I guess the sort of second area is trying to encourage people, try to help particularly younger people address some of the issues they're facing if they're not going into education. So, for example, you could use the apprenticeship scheme a little bit more actively, subsidise that a little more, prioritise apprenticeships in sectors that are least likely to be hit by what's going on in the crisis, and you know, in general, put in place so-called active labour market policies that help people with job search when we face these sort of recessions, that kind of thing, just to avoid the sort of skills atrophy or increase in unemployment that can lead to the sort of scarring or hysteresis type effects that we get in the economy that prove very expensive. Just in terms of the sort of international outlook, I guess what's been striking as much as anything is the sort of similarity in terms of the big things that have been done across countries. So in Europe, what we've seen across the board generally has been schemes that keep workers attached to their jobs. And that makes sense when you're essentially locking down the economy, almost freezing it in its current form with the hope that you can revive it later. And there's been put in place really big job protection schemes to try and achieve that. If you compare that to what's happened in the US, it looks a bit different on the face of it. So what they've done is, rather than keep people in their jobs, they have really boosted unemployment insurance payments. Across the board, there's an additional $600 a week being paid to people in the US who are registered as unemployed. So you've seen this colossal rise in the administrative measures of unemployment in the US, something like 40 million people becoming unemployed. But a lot of those are what's called temporary layoffs. So they're still attached to their firm, they're receiving payments from the government. So it's actually pretty similar to the kind of furlough type schemes that we've seen in Europe. So, you know, that initial phase has been pretty similar. And now what we're seeing is the sort of start of the phase where different countries are relaxing their lockdown restrictions. What we haven't seen yet is kind of large scale measures to help boost the economies across the world. So that'll be the key thing next, I think, in terms of what's coming on policy.
Okay, that's really very thorough. Thank you very much for that, James. Convener, that's fine. I'll let other colleagues come in now. Thank you.
Okay. Right, in that case, can I move to Gordon MacDonald, please? Gordon.
Thank you, Convener. Just to continue this discussion about how do we get people back to work, we know from indications from both governments that social distancing measures will be needed until at least the end of the year to prevent fresh outbreaks of coronavirus. And given the impact on social distancing and the level of unemployment across a whole swathe of our economy, whether it's public transport, retail, financial services, what sectors should either governments focus on, why those sectors, and what type of assistance should be provided?
Yeah, no, that's a really important set of issues, I think. So perhaps it's helpful for me to talk a bit about how I think about the overall crisis as a whole. So I was just speaking a second ago about the kind of lockdown phase of the crisis, and that I think the thing it's worth keeping in mind about all of this in terms of the crisis is if you have different types of technology to fight the spread of the virus, and I'm thinking particularly effective test, track and trace programs like the ones that they've put in place in the much referred to countries like Singapore, Taiwan, then you face different ways of fighting the virus. But if you don't have those infrastructures in place, and those countries learned a lot from the SARS outbreak a few years ago, then we can't really fight the virus in any other way than just to lock down the whole economy, stop people interacting with each other to fight the spread of the virus. So you immediately have a phase where you're seeing incredibly big impacts on your economy. And then there's a sort of second phase, which is the one we're coming into now, which is a sort of reopening phase, where essentially what policy is trying to do is generate as rapid a recovery as possible, but without essentially pushing the reproduction rate of the virus back above that critical value of 1 and allowing it to spread again. So you have these extremely difficult competing objectives as a policymaker. So you're trying to get people as much as possible back working, back to their normal lives, re-energize, bring the economy back to life, if you like. But on the other hand, you don't have much certainty about how much any particular measure will do to impact the reproduction rate. And you certainly seen on the way down that even fairly small changes in the lockdown, things like kids not going to school, implementation of self-isolation policy, that kind of thing, that has had on the way down sort of reasonably substantial impacts on the reproduction rate, and on the way out you might expect them to have sort of symmetric type effects. So you're worried about what you can do to unlock the economy. So I think what we're seeing from the governments and around the world is, very sort of slow steps, and there's a kind of asymmetry here in terms of how you unlock the economy, in the sense that if you go too quickly and then you have a second wave, then you have to lock down again, and that has really, that erodes confidence. It might be difficult to even achieve it, given fatigue in terms of implementation, all that kind of thing. So it's very sort of big downside risk. And then on the upside, people, as you open the economy, people will go back to work inevitably, but they will still be worried about the virus, and therefore they won't be living life in exactly the same way as they were before. They won't go to restaurants, doing things that involve social consumption in exactly the same way. So that's really important to keep in mind. And particularly for sectors that can't be opened up quickly, and I'm thinking about this particularly in the context of social consumption, especially the hospitality sector, really, where great swathes of that, tourism, obviously important for Scotland, will open up quite slowly. And for those sectors, what you would want to see is support continuing for a longer period. So it's I think it should be clear that we, in the future, we will want bars and restaurants. They will be viable businesses in the future. Tourism will still be a major part of the economy, and it might be slower to recover and smaller in the future than it has been in the past, but these will be important sectors of the economy going forward. So they will need additional support. Now, obviously, we're expecting to hear from the Chancellor today about the future of the job retention scheme, and the big risk here, I suppose, and we have seen some briefing on what he might do, but we don't have details of that yet, is that certainly for those key sectors, the support is withdrawn too soon, or we ask too much of firms to contribute to the people's wages, and you actually see a big shakeout in those sectors, and you see a lot of people becoming unemployed. And as I was speaking about a moment ago, then you have the issue of that becoming a bit entrenched, and it taking a long time for that unemployment to come down. So that I think is the big issue in terms of thinking about the sort of different sectors here.
You mentioned earlier. Sorry, you mentioned earlier that we could be facing the deepest recession in 300 years, as in the UK. We're in a situation where, if I understand it correctly, the level of unemployment and the fact that companies are not able to trade will see a substantial reduction in government revenue. There will be more increased support required for social security benefits. And we're in a situation where, if I understand it, last month was the record borrowing by the UK at £62 billion, up 51 billion from the same month last year. So, how much room for manoeuvre has the UK government actually got to kickstart the economy when it's facing these three problems in terms of its finances?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Resolution Foundation have done a lot of work on this, and as I mentioned earlier, the Office of Budget Responsibility have also thought about this. So if you have a relatively short period of lockdown, so a sort of 3-month pickup, the OBR have something like borrowing of 300 billion sterling this year, which would be an absolutely colossal increase, much higher than what's come during the financial crisis. And you would see, debt rising extremely quickly in that situation. So, straight away you're worrying about the fiscal position. But what our work shows is that big falls in the cost of servicing government debt. So we've seen a big fall in the interest rates on government bonds, basically mean that measures of government solvency, things like the amount you pay on your debt relative to your revenues, are actually look set to fall gradually, even as debt really spikes up. And that's essentially because the fall in the cost, and certainly as new debt is issued, that just outweighs what's happening in terms of the increase in debt. So the big thing here is that the government can afford to do more in terms of policy. It can afford to not only provide support during that first lockdown phase, but I think it has a huge role to play in terms of pushing a very sharp recovery. So I think the thing that has to be borne in mind here is that recessions tend to have these scarring effects, and we saw an extraordinarily weak recovery from the financial crisis around a decade ago. So the Scottish economy has grown on average about 0.5% in that sort of post-crisis decade, whereas after other recessions it's grown much more rapidly, more like 2.5% on average across the past 3 recessions. So there's that sort of weak context, and there's a big risk that we fall into the same trap here. So we end up in a position where we get extremely big fall in GDP, and then growth is very slow and sluggish afterwards. So the government should really be pushing hard to achieve that recovery. And as I say, on the face of it, it can afford to do so. But the critical thing for the government is that the cost of servicing that debt when it issues in financial markets doesn't rise sharply. And if it does, even modest rises would put the UK government in a difficult position in terms of the sustainability of its public finances. So that's the big risk here. And what we've seen so far is that the Bank of England, with its monetary policy, with its purchases of gilts as part of its quantitative easing programme, have really helped to keep yields low and keep and facilitate that role that that fiscal policy is playing. And the big thing to keep in mind here is that in past recessions, what you would have seen is the Bank of England, in terms of its interest rate policy, playing the lead role in terms of supporting the economy, but also supporting the economy through the recovery. We are in a position where we can't see that this time because rates are already pinned more or less as low as they can go. So it'll be down to fiscal policy to do more in that space.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Colin Beattie next, but just before I do, James, obviously you've got a lot of information there and a lot of good stuff to give us. But if I could ask you to make your answers a little more succinct, and then at the end I will maybe give you a bit of time to add anything that you feel is important that you haven't covered. Is that okay?
Okay.
Can I go to Colin Beattie then, please?
Thank you, Convener. There's a huge variety of financial measures out there in support of businesses. But nevertheless, firms do have overheads to meet, and the longer the shutdown goes on, the longer they're going to have to meet these overheads that are simply not met by government financial support measures. It's likely they'll run out of cash at some point and possibly not reopen. Is it likely, in your opinion, that there's going to be a major restructuring of the business base?
I think it's a difficult question, and it's a key uncertainty looking forward. So, obviously, what the approach we've seen so far as a government to providing a lot of, as you say, loan support. Loan support can only tide companies over so long. They saddle the companies with more debt, and they ultimately hit the value of the company. So, in the context of what I was saying earlier, if you want the reopening phase to have very rapid recovery, then you have to think about what your corporate sector is doing in terms of investing, generating jobs, all that kind of thing. And I think what we will see is some of that support potentially becoming grants and as a way of reducing debts on firms. I think that will be very important in terms of generating a rapid recovery and seeing firms invest in both jobs and their plant and machinery and new output and that kind of thing, which will be a key driver of growth in the recovery.
Is there any sign that they're going to be converting these loans to grants? I mean, I've heard nobody talking about it, so I assume it's a speculation that hopefully it might happen in some cases, in some sectors.
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways this could happen. You could see so examples here of where this type of thing has happened in the past is where we've seen big financial crises. So countries like Iceland, some of the Nordic countries where they had big financial crises in the 90s, you've seen governments take offer cheap lending and then take stakes in private sector companies, so that if we get to a position where that debt becomes a burden and that slows the recovery, then you might see something similar happening in the UK. I don't think we're at that stage yet, but that would be something that we should definitely be thinking about in terms of pushing for a rapid recovery, and we can learn a bit from some of those other examples of where this has happened, where there's been both debt write-offs and some role for the government in terms of taking stakes in private firms.
Do you think there's any way to avoid this restructuring of the business base as a result?
Well, I mean, a lot will depend on the extent to which we need to keep social distancing in place over the long term. So, if there's a vaccine put in place, the antivirals are developed, or we see perhaps like the sort of great flu of the earliest 20th century, we see it just dissipate over time, then you would expect the economy to go back to its structure that it was in previously. So the big thing that's hanging over us here is the extent to which we should be thinking about having to develop lots of new technologies to help with social distancing, and that inevitably having an impact on the overall structure of the economy, and a position where we're trying to keep the existing structure of the economy. So it could be avoided, I think, is the short answer, but in the meantime we have to deal with that uncertainty. And I think the objectives of policy to try and return as much activity and see a boost to the economy as much as we can, but without increasing the spread of the virus. So that's the tension that policymakers face at the moment.
Now, I mentioned that the question here was there was some overheads that potentially were not covered by the various government schemes. Are there any overheads within the business that you're aware of that you feel that government should be picking up but are not picking up?
I don't think so. I think that the sort of key, cost of capital, cost of paying workers has been, obviously the initial focus of that lockdown policy, where what we've seen is the government essentially trying to freeze the economy in its current state, given uncertainty about what the future looks like. So that's been the key policy so far. The big question will be, how does that support get withdrawn, and what happens to the support on the capital side? Because we will need to generate a strong recovery. You will need people to go out and spend again. You will need firms to go out and invest in jobs and increasing their output, all the rest of it. So that will definitely be a big part of what we need to see. So I don't think there's major gaps at the moment, but the question will be how that support evolves as we start to open up the economy.
And clearly, at some point,
I'm going to move on now, Colin, because we have time constraints. Can I go to Rhoda Grant, please?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Can I just ask a quick supplementary on furlough? You talked about whether or not, if employers were being asked for too big a contribution when the Chancellor changes the furlough system today, that there is a danger of people becoming unemployed. Is there a way of stopping that other than keeping the job retention scheme as is? And is there an economic cost between people going on to universal credit and the furlough scheme? Both have a cost to government, but one imagines the furlough scheme protects spending in a way that universal credit doesn't.
Yeah, if for sure, if people, if we see that big shakeout, we see people move from the furlough scheme onto unemployment benefits. I mean, in a lot of cases, it will be a lower cost to the exchequer, but what we'll see is more people in unemployment. To the extent that lasts, we'll see really big economic costs. So that's definitely something to be avoided. I guess the kind of obvious thing to do is to think about how different sectors will respond to all this. So, for example, if you're operating a holiday company that's not going to be able to come back into business till one of the kind of last sectors of the economy, let's say, then telling them that they need to start paying the wages of their furloughed workers will probably mean that they just start laying off workers. So there's an argument for having a different approach depending on different sectors. Those sectors that are most likely to see a shakeout are ones that we should be looking to protect. I mean, it's worth saying that I guess under the current plans, we would be in a position where pretty much most of the economy would be up and running by the time they're talking about employers starting to pay more of the support. If that's not the case, then seeing some flexibility around that will be important as well.
Okay. And can I just quickly ask you, you talked about some of the things we could do to protect younger people who are in danger of becoming scarred, I think having their career scarred is the phrase that's been used, but women are also at risk, as are what we term lower skilled workers, and maybe that's not such a good phrase anymore because people who were termed lower skilled workers are actually holding us all up at the moment. But what would you suggest that we do to protect those two other groups that you hadn't mentioned before?
Yeah, the Resolution Foundation work has focused a lot on this. So there's basically three groups that are bearing the brunt of this crisis: the young, women, and those on lower pay. And it's really about those groups taking the biggest health risks, so a big disproportionate number of them being key workers, and taking the biggest risks in terms of the economic hit, particularly the younger age group, as we've already talked about. So policy should obviously be thinking about all of those groups. We've talked a bit about the younger group, obviously, but in terms of low pay, we are at Resolution Foundation, we're thinking about work on the future, particularly of key workers, where I think the experience of what we have seen over the past couple of months, we really should renew questions about whether the pay of some of those workers is at the right level. So there's possibility to think about those groups in terms of the future public sector pay settlements, or that kind of thing. So I think that is something that we potentially might see some policy on. But I mean, more generally, the key thing will be thinking about, particularly for those who are affected most by all this, thinking about how we can make sure they get financial support through the crisis in terms of benefits, furlough scheme, all the rest of it, then are able to access training and active labour market help as we come out of the crisis. So those will be the big things all round, I think.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rhoda. I'm going to move to Andy Whiteman next, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Thanks. And welcome, James. I've got a couple of questions on the more kind of substantive economic challenges we face. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about new measures of measurements of well-being, basic income, etc. And we've also got older problems of long-standing nature to do with inequalities, in particular in terms of wealth. And how confident are you that government will be brave enough and bold enough and imaginative enough to be able to incorporate some of those big challenges?
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously all huge areas. I think, as I was just saying, the larger impact of this crisis on people on lower pay has put inequality in terms of income at the centre of this crisis. You're right on the wealth side. I think we don't quite have data on this yet, but what we'll be seeing is that those at the top of the income distribution will have acquired a lot of savings during this period, where a lot of things that they were spending money on is just not able to be accessed. And then at the other end of the distribution, where people are really affected, you'll see their savings and wealth really hit as they're drawing down savings, they're accessing costly borrowing, and they're borrowing from friends and family and that kind of thing. So, both in terms of wealth and income inequality, we'll see more on that side. I think policy will have to address this. So both in terms of some of the things I was just talking about, in terms of protecting those who are most vulnerable in the face of this crisis, so a collection of policy there, but also in terms of looking forward, how to pay for this crisis. So we talked briefly about the impact on government borrowing, government debt. Generally, whatever happens, we're going to see an incredibly large rise in those things. And there's a question about how quickly you want to pay that down and bring debt back to more sustainable levels, my sense would be you would want to take quite a long time to do that. And there's strong arguments for that, but the idea that you could achieve that by cutting spending in the way that we have seen in the past, I think would be extremely tricky. So both given some of the challenges in terms of demographics, environment coming up, and in terms of what's happened previously in terms of spending. So the idea that we can do lots more cuts to spending is obviously very tricky given where we are today. So I think taxes will play a big role in how we see debt starting to fall, and it makes sense to think about the types of issues that you're talking about. So what's been happening to wealth and some of the big gains that have accrued and the big increases potentially of people acquiring more savings through this crisis, that might be areas where we should think about broadening the tax base. So I think you're right that those are big issues, and I think we should see policy in those areas. I think the government will naturally have to think about that, and it's certainly something that Resolution Foundation work has already been focused on.
So two supplementaries to that. I mean, one, we tend to focus on those with least incomes by trying to boost their income, but an alternative we can do is to reduce their expenditure, and yet we've seen government very resistant to ideas about rent freezes, debt write-offs, the kind of things that will give a little bit more headroom to people in addition, obviously, to lifting their income. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. And secondly, we're still seeing from the latest HMRC data that the poorest 20% pay a higher proportion of their income in tax, all taxes, than the richest 20% do, mainly because they are more exposed disproportionately to things like VAT, flat rate taxes like that. So your comment about tax is interesting, and I'd be interested if you've got any specific ideas about how we change the fiscal regime.
Yeah, so I can take the second of those first. So yeah, there's definitely big issues around marginal rates of tax, marginal rates at which benefits are withdrawn. Those will be very high at the bottom of the income distribution. So that will be definitely a place to think about policy. I mean, what I had in mind, I guess, most was thinking about what's been happening in terms of the big shifts in terms of housing and financial wealth that we've seen over the past 30 years or so, where some of the trends that we have seen over the past few months is likely to exacerbate and increase those differences. So you might think, there's, for example, in some other countries, there are small taxes on financial wealth. For example, in Switzerland, we don't have the same sort of thing here, that we have capital gains tax. So thoughts of policy in that area could potentially be one thing that we could address. So thinking about ways to broaden the tax base that take into account the really big changes to the economy that we're seeing. Sorry, I've forgotten your first of those two.
The first question is about reducing people's liabilities for meeting the basic costs. So, for example, rent, energy, those kind of things that form a disproportionately high element of poorer people's expenditure.
Yeah, and that's obviously a big part of what's happening on the wealth side. So those at the top of the wealth distribution tend to own property and face lower housing costs and other associated costs of living linked to that. I think this is tricky. So what we've seen during this crisis is some steps to give people mortgage holidays, stop evictions on the renting side, but obviously this is something that plays into the sort of wealth and income differences that we were just talking about. So I think there's scope for policy on that side, although it'll be a little bit tricky because I guess one of the key things is what you want to do is provide more low-cost housing. That would be like the biggest thing that would make a difference in that space. And we're in a world where that is somewhat tricky to do, given high spending, the use of the government balance sheet elsewhere. So it may be that progress on that part of it at least is reasonably slow. But I agree, this is has been and will be a big issue going forward.
Thank you very much, convener.
Thank you. Can we go to Richard Lyle now, please? Richard.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, James. Given the Scottish Government's devolved powers, can you provide us with examples of initiatives it could introduce to kickstart recovery and recreate demand?
Yeah, so I won't rehearse what I've said before, but the big thing will be the overall strength of the recovery for the economy. So ensuring that that is broad-based, helps all the sectors that we know will have problems in Scotland as well. That'll be the biggest thing here. So that that's the key priority that all the devolved governments and the UK government should be addressing, and that will come in the context of what I was saying earlier about fiscal policy having to do more in this recovery than it has in past recoveries. I think I would just reiterate some of the things that we touched on briefly already. So thinking about on the training side, helping to reskill workers, bring them back into the labour market quickly, that being a key part of having a rapid recovery, a key aspect of that. Thinking a bit about things like pay on the key worker side, if there's anything we can do as part of the recovery effort there, and also thinking about some of the housing policy aspects, whether we can reduce some of the costs that particularly low income, low wealth households are facing. I mean, a key thing to emphasize here is that putting money into the hands of those towards the bottom of the income and wealth distribution will tend to have a bigger effect in terms of them being more likely to, that group being more likely to spend more of any stimulus. So that should be a sort of key principle in terms of what we do there.
Yeah, thank you, convener. I know time is short, so thank you.
Okay, Dean, you're on.
Okay, thank you, convener. James, concerns have been raised about a potential lack of alignment between the approach to reopening between the Scottish Government and the UK Government for business, and there are concerns in the Scottish business community that this might put them at something of a disadvantage. Did you recognise those concerns and the need for a consistent approach across the UK?
Yeah, I'm certainly not the best person to talk about health policy with. I generally focus on the economic side. I mean, the key thing here is that you will have differential effects on the reproduction rate at different parts of the UK. The virus spread in different places at different speeds. So, estimates I've seen put Scotland a little higher than other parts of the UK, which are seeing a bit more of a relaxation. I think the differences will probably end up being small in the grand scheme of things, and the key thing will be this balance of lockdown policy being eased in a way that allows the economy to come back to life, but without seeing a return to the virus and a damaging second wave. So that's the key thing with that part of it. I don't have anything to add in terms of the specific health aspects of that. And, I think it makes sense to have some degree of localized policy given localized conditions in terms of what's happening with the virus.
Thanks for that. A couple of supplementals. I'll try to keep them brief. From a policy context, we've heard various policy initiatives to support the economy, including Project Birch to recapitalise companies. But ultimately, am I right in thinking the fundamental question here is the size of the UK Treasury's balance sheet and the fiscal support that will be injected into the economy? And on that track, do you have an idea of ultimately the size of the fiscal and monetary injection that will be required from the Treasury? My second question is, you spoke about the shape of the recovery. Equity markets seem to be pricing in a V-shaped recovery, a very quick recovery. Do you think that's right, or do you think there's a much more prolonged recovery to come?
Yeah, obviously that's incredibly uncertain at the moment. So equity markets have rebounded very sharply. There's a lot of issues going on there in terms of not just their expectations for growth, but how conditions, what central banks are doing, and what that's doing to affect asset prices. So I think there is a sort of growing sense that this crisis won't dissipate perhaps as quickly as we'd hoped. I mean, maybe it's too early to say that it's completely plausible to say that we will only see a short lockdown and then a rapid recovery, but that looks unlikely if we end up having at least some social distancing measures in place, as people have talked about, till at least the end of the year, if not into next year. And I think there's a growing sense that it takes a while to develop vaccines, and that process is uncertain. So there is definitely a concern that we could be in a much longer period of social distancing measures. What our work at the Resolution Foundation shows is, this is not rocket science, but the longer those social distancing measures last, and you can think of potentially having periods where they're slightly eased and then tightened again. If it lasts, say for a year, then you would see a huge rise in debt based on our work up to something like 170% of GDP. So, real kind of war levels of debt. So things, a level of debt that you wouldn't have seen since the Second World War. The good news is the cost of financing that debt is low. As I said earlier, as long as that remains in place, the UK government should be solvent and should be able to provide active, large-scale support to the economy. And the key thing here is that withdrawing support too quickly will be costly in its own right, because it will reduce the size of the overall economy in future. So, there are big risks. We probably will see not an unprecedented, but a very sharp rise in public sector debt and the balance sheet. But it's affordable, and the priority should be bringing a very rapid recovery, or at least as quick as possible, when it's safe to bring the economy back online.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I don't have any further bids for questions or supplements. James, I said I would give you the opportunity at the end if there was anything you wish to add that you felt hadn't been covered. No?
Nothing from me.
Okay. Well, in that case, can I thank you very much for your time this morning and for your answers. I think they were very comprehensive. That concludes the first item of our agenda. The second item is to consider the evidence we've just heard. And can I ask the committee if you're resolved that we take this item in private? I will take silence as agreement. In that case, we are agreed. So in that case, I'll suspend the meeting briefly for the committee to move into private. Can I thank everybody who's joined us today for watching? The evidence we've heard is quite compelling, and we realise that we're on a difficult journey to get Scotland out of this crisis, and there will be some difficult choices to be made in future. We hope to see you at our next meeting. Thank you.